Good day. A virtual meeting took place on the 2nd of September between a top Chinese official, Mr. Yang Jiechi, who is a member of the Chinese Politburo and who is the director of the Office of the Central Commission for Foreign Affairs of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee, and US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. Now, John Kerry is, of course, a person with a very interesting political career. He has been a prominent senator. He has been Secretary of State under the Obama administration, and he was once presidential candidate. He is somebody with an interesting and involved career, and he has been brought back in the Biden-Harris administration, where he has been made special presidential envoy for climate change. And of course, the Biden-Harris administration has made climate change one of its key areas of policy. It is intent on promoting climate change and persuading all of the rest of the world to adopt climate change policies, and this has been a key area for John Kerry to pursue. So, bringing back John Kerry to this position, giving him this important position, both emphasizes the importance the Biden-Harris administration attaches to this issue by putting such a long-standing official and politician as John Kerry in charge of it. And at the same time, of course, it gives John Kerry an important post within the administration, where it's clear, by the way, that his brief goes well beyond the topic of climate change. Now, Yang Jiechi, by contrast, is a Chinese Communist Party official. He is not a member of the Foreign Ministry. He is a member of the Secretariat, the apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee. He's also a member of the Politburo, though not, it should be stressed, a member of the most important policy-making, decision-making body in China, which is the Standing Committee of the Politburo, which consists of just 7 members, those 7 members being China's most powerful officials, headed by the Chinese President Xi Jinping. But nonetheless, Yang Jiechi is a strong-minded and important official, and he was one of the officials who attended that summit meeting in Anchorage, and he was the official at that Anchorage summit who gave the strongest response to the comments made by Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, in that summit meeting in Anchorage, where, frankly, the Chinese steamrolled over Tony Blinken and the American delegation. Anyway, we're talking, therefore, about a discussion between 2 very important officials, both on the Chinese side and on the American side, officials whose importance perhaps is greater than their position in the respective hierarchies of their governments. Now, there is something further to say, which is, of course, that this conversation about climate change, which the United States initiated, as we will see, is also a reflection of the Biden-Harris administration's attempt to try to work on what it has classified as adversary countries, China and Russia, on what you might call the a la carte basis. In other words, the Biden-Harris administration will interact with these countries, or so it says, on issues which concern it and which concern the United States, but it might be much less willing to do so on other issues. It will refuse to discuss or be less willing to discuss those other issues, but it will work, or so it says, with those countries on issues which are relevant and important to the United States. Now, this is a position, a foreign policy line, which both China and Russia are unhappy with, to put it mildly. But climate change is perhaps one of the cases where the United States attaches a great deal of importance to the particular issue in question. And as I said, John Kerry has made it, is there to promote that issue forcefully and strongly. But the Chinese and the Russians, whilst perhaps not discounting its importance in any way, perhaps feel less, that it is perhaps less centrally important for them than it is for the United States. So we see John Kerry initiating a virtual meeting with Yang Jiechi on a matter where the United States, following its a la carte approach to diplomacy, wants the cooperation of China and Russia, and Yang Jiechi coming back and saying to John Kerry, well, hold on, we are interested in climate change, but we are not prepared to be used in a way like a sort of tap that the United States switches on when it wants to discuss something of importance to itself, but switches off when the topic is no longer important. And let us now go to the readout. And I'm going to focus entirely this time on the readout provided by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, because it is extremely interesting and it again gives an impression of the nature of diplomacy, of diplomatic interactions at the moment between the two emerging power blocs, the United States and the West, and the China-Russia-led Eurasian bloc, but also between the two countries that lead the two respective blocs, the United States in the case of the one, and China in the case of the other. And we see again how Chinese diplomacy is becoming increasingly forthright. Now, when I did a program discussing another diplomatic interchange, this time between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, and I read out the readout, a number of people on threads to the video quite correctly pointed out that all of the things that Wang Yi said to Tony Blinken were, frankly, entirely proper and factual comments, and the sort of things that no doubt leaders or foreign ministers actually say to each other. And that, of course, is true. But one must always understand that there is a great difference between a conversation and a readout. A readout generally is much more measured and uses much more measured language. And one can judge a great deal about a conversation, not just by the content of the readout, but also by its tone. And I have to say that the readouts we're now getting from the Chinese Foreign Ministry use a tone of language which is, by diplomatic standards, extraordinarily forthright and harsh. It is something which suggests that the conversations are actually extremely heated. And I'm sure that this was the case in the conversation between Wang Yi and Tony Blinken that I discussed a few days ago. But it is also, as we're going to find out in a moment, true of the conversation between Yang Jiechi and John Kerry. Anyway, let's start with the readout now and let's pass it through. On September 2nd, 2021, member of the Political Bureau of the Chinese Communist Party of China's Central Committee and director of the Office of the Central Commission for Foreign Affairs, Yang Jiechi, met with US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, via video link at request. Now, here again, we start with an important point about the readout. As I, on several occasions, said, when both sides agree to a conversation and it is a friendly call, the protocol is that neither side mentions who suggested or initiated the call, when a readout does pointedly say, as this readout has done, which side initiated the call, then a political and diplomatic point is being made. Again, we see the Chinese making it clear that it is the Americans who are calling them. It is the Americans who are, if you like, the supplicants. It is the Chinese who are the people who are listening and responding to these calls, which the United States is initiating, and it makes the United States look like it is, in fact, begging China for help, as opposed to calling the Chinese and working together with the Chinese to cooperate on things. It's a subtle point, but it is one that diplomats are extremely conscious of. Anyway, let us proceed. Yang Jiechi said, for some time, China-US relations have faced severe difficulties due to a series of erroneous acts by the United States to interfere in China's internal affairs and undermine China's interests. China is strongly opposed to and even more resolute in countering such practices. As the confrontation between China and the United States serves no one's interests, the two countries should have mutual respect, coexist peacefully, handle differences properly, and work for mutually beneficial and win-win results. This will serve the fundamental interests of the Chinese and American people and people of all countries in the world. Yang Jiechi hopes that the US side can take into consideration the common interests of the two sides and its long-term interests, take concrete steps to rectify wrongdoings, view China and bilateral relations in an objective and rational manner, respect China's political system and development path, and adopt rational and pragmatic China policies to bring bilateral ties back on track with China at an early date. So that's perhaps the opening leading paragraph. And there's a few things immediately to point out here. Firstly, this is supposed to be a discussion about climate change. Yet Yang Jiechi, who is the person whose words are being reported here, does not talk about climate change in this paragraph. He talks about the deterioration in US-China relations. But there is something perhaps even more interesting about this paragraph, and one which is easy to overlook. And we go to that opening sentence. It's John Kerry who initiated the call. It's John Kerry, therefore, who presumably spoke. And yet, the Chinese are going directly to what Yang Jiechi said. They are, if you like, jumping over John Kerry's comments in order first to focus on their own. Now, that is actually, again, in diplomatic terms, rather unusual, and it is indeed borderline rude. And let us now go and consider in detail, or at least some detail, the things that Yang Jiechi said. First of all, he speaks about a series of erroneous acts by the United States to interfere in China's internal affairs. And he talks about the need for the United States to rectify its wrongdoings, view China and bilateral relations in an objective and rational manner, and respect China's political system and development path. So he is accusing the United States of interfering in China's internal affairs, and there's no doubt that Hong Kong is playing a significant part in all of this, with the Chinese incensed at the role the United States played in supporting the political protests that took place in Hong Kong a year ago, and indeed which the Chinese say were partly instigated by the United States. And of course, it's not just Hong Kong. There's the issues of what is happening in Western China, in a province which I'm not even going to name for reasons we all know. And of course, the various other things that the United States is doing as it tries in its own way to reshape China and to change and challenge the political system there. And Yang Jiechi says that all of these are erroneous acts, that they amount to wrongdoing on the part of the United States, that they are going to create tensions between China and the United States, and that the United States needs to accept the reality of China's political system and not try to interfere with it and not seek to destabilize it and to respect China's development path. That's all very strong language, and we go on to read that China is strongly opposed to and even more resolute in countering such practices. So that's the Chinese are not going to accept US meddling and interference in China's internal affairs. By extension, they're not going to accept or tolerate US propaganda campaigns against China. And if the United States persists in that course, well, US-Chinese relations will continue to face severe difficulties. Note, by the way that Yang Jiechi speaks about China and the United States being in a state of confrontation with each other. In other words, they're not partners, they are adversaries. And we're going to come to the importance of that in a moment. But there is perhaps something else which is for me in some ways even more interesting, and by the way, almost borderline rude. And that is that he says that the United States needs to view China and bilateral relations in an objective and rational manner. Now, what he's saying is that the United States is not looking at China and bilateral relations objectively, but he's of course also saying that the United States is behaving irrationally. Now, that is a very, very strong thing to say in a face-to-face meeting, even albeit a virtual meeting, to the official of another government, accusing that official of the irrationality of his own government. In other words, saying that the United States government, at least on the topic of China, has become completely irrational. I wonder how John Kerry responded to that. But then, of course, we go to the consequences of this kind of behavior. The fact that this kind of behavior on the part of the United States, this meddling in China's internal affairs, these propaganda campaigns against China, this irrational behavior against China, which has brought Chinese and US relations into a state of confrontation, that doing so serves no one's interests, but specifically not the fundamental interests of the American people and the people of all other countries. And now we come to what Yang Jiechi had to say specifically on the topic of climate change. Yang Jiechi said China is open to communication, dialogue and pragmatic cooperation with the United States. The two countries can enhance communication, coordination and cooperation on a broad range of bilateral issues such as climate change, the response to the pandemic and economic recovery, and also on a series of major international and regional issues. The latter, by the way, almost certainly is a reference to Afghanistan, but possibly also Taiwan. At the same time, such cooperation must be two-way and mutually beneficial. And the point that Yang Jiechi here is making is that this US attempt to conduct diplomacy with China a la carte, the United States talking to China and seeking its cooperation on matters which are of interest to and beneficial to the United States, but acting confrontationally towards China on those issues which interest and concern China, that is not going to work. Whilst the Chinese are fully willing to work with the United States and to have a pragmatic relationship with the United States, that can only happen if the United States respects China. In conditions of confrontation such as exist now, cooperation, even on those issues which concern the United States, like the pandemic and climate change, that is going to be impossible. And then Yang Jiechi is reported by the Chinese readout to have focused on climate change specifically. He says, noting that China is applying the new development philosophy, Yang Jiechi said China attaches great importance to tackling climate change and has taken a series of major strategic decisions and strong measures to respond to climate change, demonstrating its active and determined attitude. China respects other countries' rights to development and choice, and China's rights to development and choice must be respected as well. We are ready to beef up policy and policy exchanges and pragmatic cooperation on climate change with the United States to facilitate the full and effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. This is, again, Yang Jiechi wagging the finger at the United States. He's telling John Kerry, look, we know you're interested in climate change. We don't need any lessons about climate change from you. We are going to develop our own economy as we please. We take climate change very seriously. We are fully committed to doing all that's needed to combat climate change, but we are absolutely not going to do things simply because you want us to. We're not going to restructure and reform our economy simply in order to satisfy your wishes and your demands, especially if climate change is going to be the pretext that you want us to do that. And the same must apply to other countries also. We're prepared to work with you, to cooperate with you, to discuss things with you, to discuss climate change with you. But it must all be done consensually on a basis of mutual respect. The United States is not there acting like the teacher, imposing its ideas and its rules on other countries, and certainly not on China. And if you try and do that, well, we will push back and we will do whatever we consider is in our interests on climate change, on every other topic. We're not going to do it simply because you want us to. That's a pretty defiant statement. And again, almost certainly not the one that John Kerry wanted to hear. And then we come to the concluding paragraph. Kerry said, US-China relations are very important to the two countries and the world, and the Paris Agreement is an outcome of both countries' joint efforts. The US side is willing to strengthen dialogue and cooperation with China and jointly cope with climate change based on mutual respect so as to inject impetus into the improvement of bilateral ties. Now, again, as was the case with the telephone conversation between Wang Yi and Tony Blinken, I don't know to what extent this paragraph actually reproduces John Kerry's words or accurately reflects his words, because it implies that Kerry weakly accepted the lecture that Yang Jiechi handed down to him. It says that, that the United States does indeed respect China, would indeed seek to strengthen dialogue and cooperation with China based on mutual respect, and that it too will aim for an improvement in bilateral ties. But there's something else about this, because that is in fact the final paragraph. Now, it's usually conventional in diplomatic exchanges or in readouts about diplomatic exchanges, especially readouts of this kind, for the readout to finish with words to the effect of the two sides, the two representatives, agreeing to remain in touch. There's nothing like that here. And sometimes, not always nowadays, but conventionally, there have also been words about the fact that the kind of atmosphere in which the meeting was conducted. For example, if we read that the meeting was conducted in a warm and friendly atmosphere, we can be sure that that is exactly what was right. But if we learn that there was a full and frank exchange of new views, well, that is essentially code for a row. Well, on this occasion, the readout is very careful not to say what kind of mood the conversation, the discussion took place in. It certainly doesn't say anything like it being, for example, frank and businesslike, which is something less than a row, but nonetheless stiff, but neither does it say that it was friendly. So this suggests to me that perhaps it wasn't an outright row, but probably the words were rather heated, and that the Americans, again, were rather taken aback by the strength of the Chinese reaction. This is something now that is happening repeatedly. It happened at Anchorage, between Tony Blinken and Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi. It happened a few weeks later when Wendy Sherman came and met with the Chinese in Tianjin. It happened a short while ago, last week, when Wang Yi and Tony Blinken discussed Afghanistan, and it's happened again with Yang Jiechi now handing down a lecture to John Kerry. The Chinese are increasingly strong and handing down lectures to the Americans. I've said previously that this is not something that the United States is used to. It must be something that, frankly, they are genuinely taken aback by, because historically and traditionally, it is the United States that hands down lectures to other countries, and it has never felt that the United States has never felt that it should be put in the same position. But this is now happening regularly, and the pace at which it is happening is intensifying under this administration. And the Chinese are not only handing down lectures, but they're publicizing the fact with these very tough readouts that their foreign ministry is publishing. But perhaps the single most important takeaway from this call is that the Chinese are now openly saying that the United States and China are in a state of confrontation, that they are adversaries. They are blaming the Americans exclusively for the fact that relations between the United States and China are in such a bad state, and they are telling the Americans in this conversation that this American attempt to pick and choose the sort of issues that the United States wants to work with the Chinese over, that is unacceptable. The Chinese will not work with it, that they will insist that the United States work with China to improve the entire range of the relationship. And only on that basis can the United States expect that China will work with the United States on those issues that concern the United States, even when they might concern China a little less. In other words, it is a very strong, even defiant statement from the Chinese to the Americans that the American style of conducting diplomacy, of reading out lectures to other countries, of imposing American ideas on other countries, be it on climate change or on any other topic, and also of interfering in the internal affairs of other countries and refusing to accept or acknowledge that this has consequences, that none of this is possible, none of this can work, and that the Chinese, for their part, will not buy it. So there we are. Will the Americans take away anything from these confrontations? Well, I think the short answer is no. I think the United States is in no mood and has no ability to accept the fact that its diplomatic approach to the Chinese, and by the way, with the Russians also, is at a dead end. That this attempt by the United States to pick and choose what topics it's going to discuss with China and also with Russia is simply not working, and that those countries will forge ahead with their doing whatever it is they consider is important to themselves, and that they will not accept any kind of situation where the United States seeks to put them on the back foot and at the same time force them into obliging the United States according to the United States' own agenda. I think for the Americans to come round to the idea that they actually have to make substantive concessions to countries like China and Russia in return for concessions in return, I think that is simply not something that the Americans fundamentally understand or are prepared to do. For a brief period during the détente era of the Cold War, the United States did show a certain grudging acknowledgement of this when it was up against the Soviet Union, then at the height of its power. But that day passed very quickly, and even at that time, as I very well remember, there were all sorts of opponents of that kind of engagement within the United States itself. Today, I think the Americans are in no mood to respect or treat the Chinese and the Russians as equals in that regard. And I think that we're going to see more of these confrontational calls in future. But it is nonetheless extraordinary to read readouts like this. It's something, as I said, that the United States is not used to. It's very discomforting. And of course, the other foreign ministries around the world will be reading these readouts and will be adjusting to them and will be learning about the deteriorating state of relations between the United States and China, and about the fact that the Chinese are taking this exceptionally strong line with the United States. I'm going to say something else, which is that sooner or later, the United States is going to have to make a choice. Either it continues on this path, in which case an outright confrontation with China on some issue, almost certainly Taiwan, is unavoidable. On the Duran, we did recently a massive live stream in which we talked about, especially with our friend, Coach Red Pill, the looming confrontation in the Pacific, and there were lots of discussions about the potential for war in the Pacific region with the United States and China facing off against each other in conditions which could lead to an outright and potentially disastrous military confrontation. If we continue along the path which we are, if the United States refuses to adjust to the rise and development and growth of Chinese, and by the way, Russian power, then of course it's going to find itself in an increasingly difficult position, and it could very well find itself in exactly that kind of military confrontation that we talked about in that live stream. Alternatively, if the United States adjusts, if it starts to engage with the Chinese and the Russians, gives up the idea of democracy promotion in their countries, which is only doing extraordinary harm, but starts to work in a way that seeks to establish clear red lines and clear limits on what each side is prepared to do. Well, we've seen even in this very confrontational call between Yang Jiechi and John Kerry that the Chinese are, in Yang Jiechi's words, open to communication, dialogue and pragmatic cooperation with the United States. And I think what the Chinese are prepared to do in that respect is true of the Russians also. We will move from a position today of confrontation to a position of perhaps greater stability and even détente. It's really for the United States, it seems to me, to decide the course it's going to take. Either it continues on its present course, in which case we could very well find ourselves in a state of uncontrollable confrontation, especially in the Pacific, with a China which is in no mood to make compromises and which is absolutely not bluffing, or alternatively, the United States eventually adjusts its foreign policy and seeks cooperation on the terms that Yang Jiechi said: mutual respect, acceptance of equality, and non-interference in the other side's internal affairs. I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. The first rule of war is don't march on Moscow. The first rule of diplomacy is don't bluff Beijing. If you bluff Beijing, your bluff is bound eventually to be called. The United States, in taking this approach towards China, needs to understand that if America is not prepared to see the confrontation with China through to the end, if it is in effect bluffing, then its bluff will be called and it will be humiliated. If, on the other hand, the United States is not bluffing, it could find itself in a war, because China, for its part, as many people have found to their cost, never bluffs. Anyway, it's a pivotal moment in world history. We shall see which course the United States takes, but the Chinese, for their part, in meeting after meeting, in call after call, in discussions with members of the administration, are making that position crystal clear. It's a striking fact, by the way, that though the President of the United States, Joe Biden, has met with Vladimir Putin of Russia, he's still not had a summit meeting with Xi Jinping, and nor, by the way, has the Vice President Kamala Harris. If the American President and Vice President do eventually meet with the Chinese leadership, they will find that the Chinese President, Xi Jinping, is going to speak to them in exactly the same way that Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi have done in all the other conversations with all the other American officials that I have discussed on programs for this channel. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. I look forward to you joining us also on our other platforms, above all Locals, where we now have a thriving community and where we're going to be increasingly doing live streams now that that technology has been perfected. Please, in fact, do seriously consider joining us on Locals, because, of course, we have had all these other problems I've discussed with you. The fact that PayPal has recently withdrawn its services from us, and what has happened to other people who found themselves in that kind of situation with PayPal. What they have found, I understand, is that there are other problems which follow on other platforms. We've encountered nothing like that for the moment. Certainly I haven't done on my own channel, but you never know. If you value what we do, then perhaps come to us on Locals. It's very easy to become a member there, and you will find out you can hear all that we have to say, and you can hear it securely in the confidence that we will continue to say it. And by the way, we're now providing a lot of material on Locals, which is exclusive to that channel, to that platform. And by the way, we are also going to be doing the same with Super You, another free speech platform which we are increasingly engaging with and which we find increasingly helpful to ourselves. And of course, we are also available on other platforms, BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, and Rumble, and all the rest. And you find links to all these platforms under this video. And also you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things you will find there, our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And thank you for joining me again today. Please make sure that you are subscribed to this channel, and please remember to tick this like button if you've liked this video. Thank you again. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.